In 1965, Fred and Edwina Rogers and their adult son Charles were residing in a peaceful area of Houston. The family tended to keep to themselves, especially with Charles's antisocial and reclusive behavior. In fact, many neighbors were unaware that Charles lived at home with his parents as they never saw him around. A family member inquired at the Houston police check on his elderly aunt and uncle after not hearing from the Rogers for several days. The patrolman saw food on the dining room table but could not find Fred or Edwina. When they opened the fridge, many meat packages were neatly stacked on top of one another. 2 human heads were then discovered in the vegetable bin. When more police officers arrived on the scene, they began to remove the bags of severed body parts from the refrigerator. They were Fred and Edwina Rogers' remains. Autopsies revealed that Fred had sustained a severe head injury from a claw hammer, while Edwina had been severely battered and shot. Fred's genitalia had been cut out, and his eyes had been gouged out. The internal organs of the pair had been flushed down the toilet. There was no sign of Charles. He is the only suspect in the case as of this writing. Charles was ruled deceased in 1975 because no sign of him could ever be located. The case has never been solved. Tsutomu Miyazaki, dubbed the Otaku Murderer, is one of the most infamous Japanese serial killers in history. He was convicted of slaying 4 young girls, aged 4 to 7, in Saitama and Tokyo between August 1988 and June 1989. He kidnapped the girls, slayed them in his car, then mutilated and molested their corpses. He also practiced cannibalism and kept their body parts as trophies. Miyazaki is said to have disassembled one of his victims' bodies, retained her hands, and continued to cannibalize and drink blood from them. In July 1989, Miyazaki was detained in Hachiji after being accosted while photographing a young girl in her underwear. Despite being diagnosed with one or more personality disorders, he was found to be sane and conscious of his crimes and their repercussions. Miyazaki received the most extreme sentence in 1997 and was hanged in 2008. In August 2016, Kennedy Ife, 26, of North London, reportedly started acting strangely and aggressively after experiencing throat pain. Before his family restrained him to a bed using cable ties and excessive force, he allegedly bit his father, threatened to cut off his own p********, and spoke of having a python or snake inside of him. According to his brother, Kennedy needed to be restrained because he would hurt either himself or his family members. After Kennedy had been confined to his bed for 3 days, his brother called emergency services and explained that he had been complaining of dehydration. When the emergency services arrived, he was pronounced deceased at 10:17 a.m. The court was informed that the family spent those 3 days trying to heal Kennedy through restraint and prayer. All 7 of Kennedy Ife's relatives were charged with manslaughter, false imprisonment, and allowing a vulnerable adult to pass away. Kennedy Ife's body had over 60 wounds, including what seemed to be a bite. On March 14, 2019, following a 4-day jury deliberation, all 7 family members were found not guilty of manslaughter. In 1977, Colleen Stan, 20, was hitchhiking from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to a friend's birthday when her abductor Cameron Hooker and his wife Janice picked her up. The following 7 years, Stan would spend a large portion of her time, sometimes up to 23 hours a day, imprisoned in a wooden box without access to light, sound, or fresh air, eating cold food scraps, and using a bedpan. The young woman was also exploited sexually by Cameron using various items. Throughout those 7 years, Stan was occasionally given freedom. She would have to care for her captor's children, cook and clean for herself, was allowed to go jogging, visit her family on her own, and even get a job. Still, she was always kept in place by brainwashing and threats, including claims that a mysterious and dangerous group known as the Company would slay her and her entire family if she tried to flee. But everything changed when Cameron said that Stan should be his second wife. Stan ultimately boarded a bus and escaped to her family. At the same time, Janice cooperated fully and turned in her husband in exchange for immunity. Stan, only a few months away from turning 28 at the time, wasn't free of her suffering until August of 1984. Even then, the many years of torture and brainwashing had kept her from reporting what had happened to the authorities. When the entire story was revealed to the public, it startled not only the police but the world as a whole, spawning hundreds of films, TV shows, and even songs. Daniel Camargo Barbosa, also known as the sadist of El Charquito, was a Colombian serial murderer alleged to have *ped and slayed up to 180 young girls throughout Colombia and Ecuador between the 1970s and 1980s. Camargo's mother passed away as a newborn, and his father was emotionally distant. Later his father wed again. Because of her infertility issues, Daniel's new stepmother started mistreating and humiliating him by clothing him as a girl. Because of this, his classmates at school made fun of him. She would also frequently beat him in front of his friends. After learning that the woman he planned to marry wasn't a virgin, he made a deal with her that if she helped him find other virgin girls to have *X with, he would stay with her. This was the beginning of their criminal cooperation. After a number of *PES and homicides, Camargo was only convicted of *ping in slaying one victim and then imprisoned in Colombia. In 1977, he was sentenced to 25 years but escaped jail in 1984. At least 54 *PES and slayings were committed by Camargo in Guayaquil between 1984 and 1986. Because they didn't realize that one person could have slayed so many people, the authorities initially assumed that a gang was responsible for all the fatalities. He abused and slayed mainly poor, defenseless young women. He went up to them, claiming to be a foreigner looking for a Protestant pastor. He was approached by the police on patrol because they thought Camargo was acting strangely. They discovered that he was carrying a bag containing the bloody clothing and part of the genitalia of his most recent victim, as well as a copy of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. In 1989, Camargo was found guilty and given the maximum sentence possible in Ecuador at the time, 16 years in jail. The nephew of one of Barbosa's numerous victims fatally stabbed him in a prison in 1994 at the age of 64. My grandmother's entire life had a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, she would be walking down a long dark hallway, turn to the left, open a door, and see something terrible. She'd always wake up before seeing what it was. In her 40s, she, her husband, my dad, and my aunt were on vacation. They booked the hotel at the last minute, so they ended up having to get 2 rooms with 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the floor. My dad wakes up around 3 a.m. and can automatically tell something's not right. He calls out in the darkness, "Dad." No response. He turns on the bedside light, "Dad," he says, a little louder this time. Still no response. Getting worried, he slides out of bed and shakes his father. He doesn't wake up. My dad ran down the hotel hallway to my grandma's room and started banging on the door. My grandma worriedly opens the door, and my dad shouts, "Something's wrong with Dad." He leads her down the hallway. A long hallway. To the last door on the left. My grandmother reaches the door, turns to the left, and sees her husband, deceased, in bed. Heart attack. She never had the dream again. If you've ever been to Portland or you know that our public transportation system is pretty nice and the MAX system has a tram that runs between the airport and the city center until fairly late at night. I was coming home from seeing my family at Christmas and my flight came in very late, so I was lucky enough to catch the last MAX home. Because it was so late it was just me, and a guy who looked homeless sitting a few seats ahead of me. He was sleeping with his head against the window. I paid little attention to him but noticed his head lolling around and wondered if he was wasted. Anyway, we get to the city center and there are cops waiting there because apparently the homeless guy sitting in front of me is being escorted off the tram. Airport security had tried to get him off before and thought he was ignoring them and refusing to move. And that's when both the cops and I find out that the guy had been deceased the whole time. He had overdosed at some point before the Macs had even arrived at the airport. We had been riding on that dark midnight ride alone together with one of us fairly deceased. For ghost hunters, paranormal activity seekers, and adrenaline junkies, the Villisca Axe Murder House in Villisca, Iowa, is a well-known tourist destination. Paranormal investigators, familiar with the house, declared it among the most haunted locations in America following the summer 1912 mass homicide, right next to 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, where 5 people were slain in the fall of 1974. The case in which 6 children and 2 adults had their skulls completely smashed while asleep in bed was never solved and remains a mystery to this day. The location of a horrifying mass homicide was bought in 1994, restored to its 1912 condition, and turned into a tourist attraction. Paranormal investigators who have toured the house have produced audio, video, and visual evidence of paranormal activity in the place shrouded in mystery. Children's voices, falling lamps, moving ladders, and flying objects have all caused tours to end early. But the haunting changed into something more sinister in the fall of 2014. On November 7, Robert Stephen Larson Jr., 37, of Rhinelander, Wisconsin, had a routinely scheduled paranormal tour with his friends. Larson was found with a self-inflicted chest stab wound and was taken to a neighboring hospital. According to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, the self-inflicted wound occurred at approximately 12:45 a.m., roughly when the 1912 axe murders in the home happened. Larson recovered from his injuries but never spoke publicly about what happened that day. The Villisca Axe Murder House is still operating today. At the time of writing, the price of the overnight stay is $428, and anyone over the age of 12 can take a tour. One of China's most notorious serial killers in history is Wang Chang. Chang never attended school since his father was an alcoholic and abused him. He was thus troubled, ignorant, and unable to hold a job. In 1995, Wang slayed his first victim. By the time he was captured in July 2003, Wang had slayed 45 people. According to official records, he was also found guilty of 10R***PS. In his confessions, he admitted that after slaying young girls, he loved sexually exploiting them. Wang Chang was 30 when he was executed in 2005. Gary Ridgway, now 73, from Washington, Oregon, is convicted of 49, aged 14 to 38, and suspected of at least 71 homicides, making him one of the deadliest serial killers in America. Allegedly, most of Ridgway's victims were S**X workers and other women in precarious situations, such as underage runaways. After the first 5 victims of Ridgway were discovered in the Green River, the press gave him his moniker of the Green River Killer. He would often strangle his victims and dump their bodies in forests and overgrown areas in King County. He frequently went back to the bodies to **PE them. He was spared the most extreme penalty and given a life sentence without the possibility of parole as part of a plea agreement where he agreed to provide the locations of still missing women. Ridgway later admitted in his testimony that he had lost count of the number of people he had slain.